All right, let's jump into this deep dive on the Gambia's economy. Looks like we've got a lot to cover, especially about their credit rating and the whole debt distress thing. You really want to understand how real the possibility of economic trouble is, and of course, how to avoid it. We're focusing on this video from Rizki-Produkt official TV for this one. It's a group pushing for social democratic changes in the Gambia. They've laid out some pretty bold ideas.
Yeah, it's definitely ambitious. But they don't just point out the problems. They actually give specific steps the Gambia could take to fix its economy. And get this, they use examples from other countries, some that did really well and some that, well, didn't.
Oh, so it's like we're about to learn from a real-life economics textbook, but with real-world examples, not just theory. Before we get to those examples, though, let's break down some basics. The video talks a lot about credit ratings. For someone who's not, like, a finance expert, why should we even care about those? What do they mean for a whole country?
Think of a credit rating as a measure of how much the world trusts a country. It tells lenders and investors how risky it is to lend them money. A good credit rating means lower interest rates, easier access to funds, and a more stable economy, generally. Unfortunately for the Gambia, they're facing a high risk of debt distress. And that's not just about having debt, it's about maybe not being able to even make the interest payments, let alone actually paying back what they borrowed.
And if that happens, the consequences are pretty bad, right? It's not just about balancing a budget anymore.
Exactly. It's way bigger than that. Think about it. If the Gambia can't pay its debts, they might have to cut essential services like healthcare and education. Their currency could lose value, making things more expensive for everyday people. And it becomes way harder to attract future investment because everyone's worried they won't get their money back.
So, yeah, a downward spiral they really need to avoid. And the video says that mismanaging public borrowing and investments is a big part of this problem. So how do they fix it? Sounds like this Rizki-Produkt group has a 6-step plan.
Yeah, they do, and it covers a lot of ground. The first step is all about fiscal discipline, basically getting the government's finances in order.
Okay, so less spending like there's no tomorrow and more responsible budgeting. But what does that actually look like?
Well, they break it down into 3 main actions. First, increasing tax revenue. But not just by raising taxes on everyone. They specifically talk about going after tax evasion and broadening the tax base. So closing loopholes that let some people and businesses avoid paying their fair share and making sure everyone who should be contributing actually is.
Makes sense. It's about fairness, not just squeezing more out of people who are already paying. What's the second part of this fiscal plan?
Reducing how much they rely on borrowing from other countries. It's easy to think you can just keep borrowing to cover expenses. But we've all seen what happens when you rack up credit card debt. It becomes a huge burden, and the interest alone can be crippling. The Gambia needs to get a handle on its borrowing. And that means not just taking on less new debt, but also managing the debt they already have, maybe even restructuring it to make the interest payments less overwhelming.
Tough decisions, but probably necessary to avoid that whole debt distress thing. What's the third part of this fiscal plan?
They call it curbing government expenditures. And that's not just about saving pennies on office supplies. It's about taking a hard look at things like big salaries and benefits for government officials. They argue that those funds could be better spent on social services, programs that actually help people get out of poverty.
Right, it's about priorities, making sure the money goes where it'll do the most good.
Honestly, if I were thinking about investing in the Gambia, these first 3 steps would definitely make me feel better about it. It shows they're serious about getting their finances in order. I agree. Those actions show a commitment to responsible governance, and that's super important for attracting investors. But fiscal discipline is just the beginning. The video also stresses the need for diverse economic growth. It's not enough to just cut spending. You need to find sustainable ways to make more money.
So it's not just about saving, it's about earning, but doing it in a smart way that can last. Right now, the Gambia's economy depends a lot on tourism and agriculture. That sounds kind of risky, right? Like, what if another pandemic hits or climate change messes up their farming?
You got it, exactly. Their current model leaves them super vulnerable to things they can't control. To build a more resilient economy, they need to branch out, find new income sources. The video talks about encouraging investment in new areas, like technology, manufacturing, and renewable energy. Imagine if the Gambia became a hub for solar power. Not only would they have cheaper, greener energy, but they could potentially export it, and that would bring in even more money.
Plus, that kind of investment would attract foreign companies and create new jobs, a real positive chain reaction. But what about tourism and agriculture, the things they already do? Are they just giving up on those?
Not at all. They actually suggest wings to make those sectors stronger, too. For agriculture, they talk about modernizing farming practices and investing in infrastructure. This could boost food security for the Gambia and reduce their reliance on imports, which helps their trade balance. They even suggest exploring new markets for higher-value agricultural products. So instead of just exporting raw materials, they could process them into more valuable goods, bringing in even more revenue.
So working smarter, not just harder, adding value to what they already have. Okay, we've got fiscal discipline and diverse growth. What's the third part of their plan?
This one might seem a bit less concrete, but it's super important: improving transparency and accountability. They say that getting rid of disinformation and strengthening public institutions is key. It creates an environment where businesses and investors feel safe.
Yeah, that makes sense. Who wants to invest in a system where you can't be sure the rules are fair or that your money will actually be used for what it's supposed to be? It'd be like building a house on sand. So what do they recommend to actually improve governance in the Gambia?
Two main things. First, stronger ways to fight corruption. And they're very clear that these systems need to be truly independent, not controlled by politicians. That way, there's real accountability. People in power know they can't just abuse their position for personal gain.
Checks and balances, gotta have them. What's the second part of improving governance?
They call for institutional reforms, especially in areas like finance, infrastructure, and social services. This means making government institutions more capable of actually doing their jobs well. It's not enough to have good ideas. You need competent people to put them into practice.
It's about making the government work better for the people, which builds trust, both from citizens and from outside investors. Okay, they've got a solid plan, but let's be real. Implementing all this is a huge task, right? The Gambia can't just become an economic powerhouse overnight. The video acknowledges that, right? They talk about needing outside help.
They do. Step 4 in their plan is about strategically using international partnerships and aid. The Gambia already works with organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. The key is making sure any aid they receive is used effectively and for the right things.
So no more vanity projects or lining the pockets of corrupt officials. What does responsible aid look like in this case?
They suggest negotiating loans and grants with good terms, minimizing interest and focusing on projects with a long-term impact, like infrastructure improvements or investing in people's skills and education. They also talk about using aid for capacity-building programs. Imagine training programs that teach government officials how to manage finances better, or improve governance, or boost agricultural productivity.
It's like giving someone the tools to help themselves, rather than just a temporary fix. Okay, we've covered 4 steps: fiscal discipline, diversification, good governance, and strategic aid. What's next?
Step 5 tackles the elephant in the room: debt management. Given the Gambia's high risk of debt distress, they need a plan to get it under control, not just for now, but for the long term. And that means changing how they think about borrowing.
Yeah, no more taking out loans just to keep the lights on, or to fund spending that isn't sustainable. They need to be way more strategic.
You got it. The focus should be on borrowing for projects that actually help the country repay its debts. Like, imagine investing in renewable energy infrastructure. Not only would this reduce reliance on expensive fossil fuels, but it could actually generate revenue through electricity sales. That's the kind of debt that makes sense.
So smart borrowing for things that can pay for themselves. But what specific actions do they recommend for managing this debt? It's easy to say manage it better, but how do they actually do that?
Well, they have a couple of suggestions. First, exploring ways to restructure their existing debt, maybe negotiating for lower interest rates, longer repayment periods, or even a reduction in the principal amount. Of course, this would require cooperation from lenders. But it's been done before in other countries in similar situations. They also emphasize something called domestic resource mobilization, which basically means finding ways to finance development without relying so much on borrowing from other countries.
So looking inward for solutions before looking outward for loans. Makes sense, but that probably takes some creativity. Okay, we're on the last step of their plan. What's number 6?
This one might seem a bit softer than the others, but it's super important for long-term success: developing social and human capital. It's about recognizing that a country's greatest asset is its people.
Right, investing in education, healthcare, skill development. The Gambia has a young population. If those young people have the right opportunities and skills, they can really drive economic growth for years to come.
Exactly. And it's not just about basic education. It's about anticipating the skills that will be needed in the future. Think about training programs that prepare young Gambians for careers in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, or emerging tech sectors. Those are the kinds of investments that pay off for generations.
It's about long-term thinking, understanding that a healthy, educated population is the foundation of a thriving economy. What else do they suggest in this area?
Improving access to good healthcare is a major focus. They talk about addressing issues like malnutrition, maternal health, and access to basic medical care, especially in rural areas. These things have a huge impact on people's lives, but they also affect the economy. A healthy population is a productive population.
It's all connected, yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, we've covered all 6 steps of their plan. It's ambitious, but they've really thought it through. It's not just random ideas, it's a clear roadmap for the Gambia to turn things around.
And that's where those real-world examples they use are so helpful. They don't just tell the Gambia what to do. They show how other countries have tackled similar challenges, both successfully and unsuccessfully. These case studies provide valuable lessons for the Gambia to consider.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into those case studies. Let's see what the Gambia can learn from the experiences of other countries that have faced similar economic challenges.
All right, so let's kick things off with Zambia. They've had their own issues with debt distress, and they relied way too much on just one thing for income, kind of like the Gambia.
Oh, so their story could be like a warning sign, but also show some potential solutions. What exactly happened in Zambia? What got them into trouble?
Well, Zambia has always depended on copper mining for most of its income, which means they're really vulnerable to changes in global copper prices. When those prices dropped, and they already had a lot of debt, things went downhill fast. Their credit rating tanked, basically signaling a real risk of them not being able to pay back their loans.
Yikes. That does sound a lot like what the Gambia is dealing with. So how did Zambia react? Did they just give up?
Nope, not at all. They actually took some pretty big steps. First, they started talking to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and to the people they owed money to try and restructure their debt, trying to get better terms on those loans, like lower interest rates or longer repayment periods, basically easing the burden a bit.
So it's not always about avoiding debt completely. It's about managing it responsibly and making sure it doesn't get out of control. Did they do anything else besides focusing on the debt, like trying to fix the bigger economic problems?
Yeah, they realized they couldn't just keep betting everything on copper. They need to diversify, find new ways to make money that weren't so tied to global markets. So they started promoting things like agriculture and renewable energy as new areas for growth.
Like having a more balanced portfolio, spreading the risk. Did it work? Did they manage to climb out of the economic slump?
They made some progress, for sure. But changing an entire economy takes time. Building new industries, attracting investment. The main takeaway is that relying too much on one thing is risky, especially in a global market that can change so fast. It's a weakness that the Gambia needs to tackle head-on if they want to build a stronger, more resilient economy.
That whole thing with Zambia and the IMF is interesting. I feel like those organizations sometimes get a bad reputation, like they're just imposing harsh conditions on countries that need help. But in this case, it sounds like it was a good thing for Zambia.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a mixed bag. There's definitely been a lot of debate about how effective and fair those conditions are. But for Zambia, working with the IMF not only gave them some financial breathing room, it also showed the world that they were serious about fixing their problems. And that can make investors feel a lot more confident.
So, it's about rebuilding trust, showing everyone you're committed to responsible economic management. Okay, so Zambia's story has some important lessons about the dangers of putting all your eggs in one basket and the potential benefits of working with international institutions. What about Ghana? They've had their own economic roller coaster, right? What can we learn from them?
Ghana's story is kind of interesting, a mix of good and bad, but it definitely offers some insights. They've had to deal with high public debt and relying too much on borrowing from other countries, just like the Gambia. And, as you might expect, that led to credit rating downgrades, which makes it more expensive to borrow money in the future. But here's the thing. They've also tried some promising strategies that the Gambia could learn from.
Okay, let's hear about those strategies. What did Ghana do right that the Gambia could copy?
One of their biggest successes was improving their tax collection system, cracking down on tax evasion and making sure more people and businesses were paying their fair share. Kind of like what Rizki-Produkt is suggesting for the Gambia. This helped them increase their own revenue, meaning they didn't have to borrow as much from others.
So building up their own capacity to make money instead of always relying on handouts. What else did they do?
They also invested a lot in infrastructure and really tried to diversify their economy beyond just cocoa and gold exports. They've been promoting growth in things like technology and manufacturing, trying to create a more balanced and resilient economy.
So tackling the problem from multiple angles, just like Rizki-Produkt recommends for the Gambia. But did it actually work in Ghana? Have they seen any real results from these strategies?
They have seen progress, but it hasn't been easy. There are still challenges, especially when it comes to creating good-paying jobs and making sure everyone benefits from the economic growth, not just a select few.
That's a good point. Economic progress isn't just about numbers, it's about people and making sure everyone has a chance to participate and benefit. Was there anything specific Ghana did that really stands out as a lesson for the Gambia?
Their experience with the IMF is worth noting. Back in 2019, Ghana worked out a deal with the IMF to help stabilize their economy. This gave them some much-needed financial support, but it also reassured investors that Ghana was serious about making changes. Working with the IMF isn't always popular, but sometimes it's a necessary step to get back on track.
Sometimes you need to ask for help, even if it's tough. It's a reminder that you can't always do it alone. Okay, so Ghana's story is a mix of wins and losses, but overall, it seems like they're moving in the right direction. What about Mozambique? I know they've had a pretty rough time economically. What can we learn from their experience?
Mozambique's story is a cautionary tale. It shows what can happen when good luck meets bad management. They found massive natural gas reserves, which should have been a huge boost for their economy, but instead, they fell into a trap that the Gambia needs to avoid at all costs: mismanagement, corruption, and unsustainable debt.
Wow, okay, let's break that down. What went wrong in Mozambique? How did they mess up such a great opportunity?
Well, they started borrowing a ton of money, not just for important infrastructure projects related to the gas industry, but for all sorts of things, a lot of which didn't really make any money back. And on top of that, there was a ton of corruption. Money that should have been used to develop the country ended up in the pockets of corrupt officials.
So it's not enough to just have money. You have to use it wisely, transparently, and ethically. What happened when Mozambique couldn't repay those loans? How badly did it hurt their economy and their people?
Well, their economy basically crashed. They couldn't pay their debts, their currency lost value like crazy, inflation went through the roof, and they had shortages of everything. People couldn't even afford the basics anymore. It led to huge protests and political instability, a real mess.
It sounds awful, a total nightmare. What did they do? Was there any way to fix it?
They had to go to the IMF for a bailout, a $3 billion package, but it came with a lot of strings attached. They had to agree to cut government spending and raise taxes, which put even more pressure on their already struggling economy. And they had to make big economic reforms to address the root problems that got them into this mess in the first place.
So, a tough road, but maybe the only way to avoid a complete collapse? What's the main lesson here for the Gambia? Just don't borrow from China.
It's not that simple. The real lesson is to be smart about debt. Don't borrow too much, and don't depend on just one lender. Diversify your sources and make sure any money you borrow is used for productive investments, things that actually generate returns, not just flashy projects that don't really benefit the economy.
So, strategic borrowing for projects that make sense in the long run. Sri Lanka's experience is a stark reminder that even strong economies can be vulnerable to debt if they're not careful.
Absolutely. It shows how important careful planning and a commitment to transparency and accountability are. If the people in charge are making reckless decisions and there's no oversight, it can have devastating consequences for everyone.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the Gambia's specific challenges to broader lessons from around the world. It's clear that the Gambia's economic future is tied to the global system, for better or worse.
Yeah, no doubt. Their own decisions will be huge, of course. But they're also operating within a global economy that can be unpredictable and often unfair, especially to smaller, less developed countries.
But with all this complexity, all these things, the Gambia can't fully control. Can they still make a difference? Can they actually choose their own path?
I think they can. They can't control things like global commodity prices or the rules of trade, that's true. But they can control how they manage their money, how they invest in their people, and how they work with the international community.
So understanding the limits, but also the opportunities within those limits. Making smart choices even when it seems like there aren't many.
Exactly. And that's why those case studies are so helpful. They show there's no magic solution that works everywhere. What worked in Rwanda might not work in the Gambia. What went wrong in Mozambique might be avoided in the Gambia if they learn from those mistakes. It's about adapting those lessons to their own situation.
Being proactive, not just reacting to whatever happens. Taking control of their own destiny, even when facing powerful outside forces.
And that brings us to something I think is really important. You're not just watching all this happen from the sidelines. You've clearly taken the time to learn about these complex issues, and that's the first step to making a difference.
You're right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big these problems are, to think, what can one person do? But you've already done something by informing yourself, and there's so much more you can do.
For sure. You can stay engaged with these issues, follow the news, support organizations working to make a difference in the Gambia and other countries facing similar challenges.
You can also hold your own elected officials accountable. Ask them what they're doing to address global economic issues, to promote fair trade, to support responsible aid programs.
And don't underestimate the power of your own choices as a consumer. Buy products that are ethically sourced, support businesses committed to sustainability and fair labor practices. Those choices might seem small, but they really can add up.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of a global system, and our individual actions, even the little things, can have an impact.
And as we saw with those case studies, change is possible. It's not guaranteed, but it can happen. It takes a combination of smart policies, collective action, and individual choices.
This deep dive has been all about the Gambia's economic situation, the lessons from other countries, and the power of informed action. But in the end, it's up to each of us to decide what role we want to play in creating a more just and sustainable world.
Don't underestimate your own ability to make a difference. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for positive change.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic.